Okay.
Shravan.
Right.
A very warm welcome to all our viewers to the fifth edition of Cedrus Knowledge Series, an initiative wherein we have one expert each month speaking on a variety of topics ranging right from investing to well-being. Cedrus Wealth Partners was founded in 2007 by Mr. Nilesh Bajaj to provide holistic financial solutions to individuals and families. We at Cedrus believe in knowledge first, and the knowledge series is one such step to make informed decisions amongst the various asset classes. For our fifth edition, we are extremely honored to have Mr. Anand Tandon as our esteemed guest. Mr. Tandon is the co-founder of Griffin Investment Advisors Limited. He is a BTech from IIT Kanpur and a PGDBM from IIM Ahmedabad. He has over 20 years of experience in the capital markets. He has in the past held senior leadership role at ASK Raymond James and Associates, Edelweiss Capital, and Global Analytics Group of Citibank. Mr. Anand is a regular media commentator on capital market trends and appears regularly on CNBC, Bloomberg UTV, ET Now, and various other business channels. Once again, a very warm welcome to all our viewers and our speaker. I would request Nilesh sir to speak a few words.
Thanks, Unnati, for the lovely introduction. It's indeed a pleasure having Mr. Anand Tandon between us in the middle of such challenging times and having experienced, a dream run in the equity market last financial year. No one really thought that we would be locked up again this year as last year when COVID hit the whole world last year. Last year when valuations were attractive, this is what we came across. When the valuations were attractive and after the huge fall, investors apparently became more fearful. In fact, they were not really open to invest in the equity markets. This time round, when valuations are looking stretched, I realized that quite a few investors have actually turned excited. They want to invest on every falls. Like a lot of questions are lingering in our minds as to how do we actually approach the equity markets now. That's precisely we have Mr. Anand Tandon with us, who's got more than 2 decades of experience in the financial markets. I'm sure we will require his experience this time round to understand where the markets are expected to go this year. So without delaying any longer, I would request Mr. Anand Tandon to take it up from here. This time it's a little different. Generally, we have a moderated session, but this time Mr. Anand would answer all our questions through a presentation prepared exclusively for our viewers. In the meantime, if any of our viewers have any questions to be asked, please post the same, and we will be happy to take at the end of the presentation. So Anand, welcome to the 5th edition of Knowledge Series.
Well, thank you, Nilesh, for having me, and thank you, Unnati, for the introduction. Just one small variation. Now it is close to 30 years that I have been in the market. So, one ages and moves on, and one realizes that as you become older, there is less certainty about whatever you think you know about the markets or where they are headed. So frankly, I'm not going to perhaps be able to answer a lot of the questions. However, what I thought I would try and do is to lay out the scenario of where we are and how it looks from here on in the context of what history has taught us. So my presentation actually looks at some of the macro scenario that we are in currently. I'm not going to be focusing on GDP or anything of that sort, but things which matter to the investment community today, which is that, how overvalued are we? If we are, where does it go from here? And I'll throw up some of the slides. To begin with, the first thing I want to point out is that the world markets today are totally correlated. Right? So we are no more an island in ourselves, though we like to think that somehow what happens to Indian markets is something to do with what we do in India, including what policies we follow and so on. The reality is that very little of what happens in India is because of what we do in India. Much of it is what happens in the rest of the world. And more importantly, what we do in India usually is what drags us down. It is not something that picks us up and runs away with it. So, for example, we thought that, post the budget, there was something dramatic that changed in India, and because of which the policy changes, something would have happened. But if you had looked at some of our neighboring markets, including China, you would have seen that they also performed immediately after that time frame. There was no budget there. If you look at the graph on the left, you look at the peak, the place where we are right now, you can see that, if you were to look at correlation of MSCI Indian index and the MSCI emerging market index, or the MSCI index for, all countries, those are the two in blue and red, we have a correlation of about 80%. So, it's not as if we are doing anything in isolation. And that is why I have learned over a period of time that you have to look at what is happening in the largest markets in the world if you want to take a macro top-down view of where the market can do here. Interestingly enough, if you look at the 25-year chart on the right, the performance of MSCI India and MSCI US also has been almost identical. We have indexed it from 100, and you are exactly at the same point. There are huge variations in between, and the variations have been against us over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, if you were to see the situation, the US index has done better than the Indian index. But over a longer period, that also has turned out to be more or less the same. Importantly, don't worry too much about the return. The question is that the important fact is that, the correlation, the trend, the direction is more or less the same. So the biggest thing that has happened in the last decade or more, after the great financial crisis, the 2007-2008 crisis, is that the markets are no longer free. They don't operate on the basis of only earnings growth of companies. They essentially also have to factor in the tsunami of money that the central banks keep on pumping into the system. And a look at this graph tells you that in great detail. So I've used M1 because that's the most basic measure of money supply in the US. Just take a look at the graph on the left-hand side. Think about it. 75% of all dollar flows that you see in the world today happened in the last 12 months. So, you had a situation where M1 went up to 18 trillion from something like 6 or less, 5. So, and that has been mirrored across, as you'll see in my next slide. But if you see what RBI is doing also, we have almost had a 35 plus percentage growth in RBI's balance sheet as well. Essentially, a third of all the money that you see in rupees over the last, from ever to now, has been created in the last 1 year. And they are not alone. The same trend is seen in whether you look at the Japanese currency or you look at the European currency. So all of that money has to find its way somewhere. Now, typically, you would expect that some of it would be consumed, and it has. But look at this graph. We have a situation where the growth in deposits in the US has grown up by 125% in the last 12 months. So a country which usually does not have any savings, as you are aware, the US market, consumers don't have much money. They are looking at a situation where they have got 125% growth in their current in their deposits. And this is just the demand deposits. We're not talking about the general bank account. And while commercial and industrial loans, the one on the right-hand side, has actually gone up very sharply, it had a very sharp fall as well. So if you see, the net increase has only been about 350 billion. It went up by 650 and then it's come down again. Interestingly, a trend which is also reflecting in India. So here too, we've had a very sharp increase in the balance sheet of the RBI, as I showed you earlier. And yet, the bank credit continues to slow. So if you forget about the sharp drip that we saw in 2020, it has gone back to a slightly slowing down curve path that it had been following for quite a while before that. Now within this, much of this has been because the large companies are continuously deleveraging themselves. You are aware that we've had a situation where most of the companies have not been adding capacities because they are not operating at full capacities, and they have been trying to pay off the debt that they took in the last cycle. The medium companies, however, are showing signs of requiring more money. And that is partially, I guess, because of the stress that they are under because of COVID and the lockdowns and so on. Partially because also perhaps they have started to do a little better after the lockdown has opened and perhaps the working capital requirements are a little more. But net at a bank credit level, we are seeing a slowdown continuing. So the banks are flush with money as well.
Anand, just one question. I would
Sure.
like to interrupt in your presentation is that do you feel that compared to last year, there was a lot of anxiety among people that there will be a lot of delinquencies, with the COVID situation. Do you feel that risk yet lies for this financial year, or it's behind us?
So, Nilesh, there are two different markets there. See, what has happened is that the large companies, like I pointed out, have been deleveraging themselves. So, the big corporate facing problems that we had, where almost 12, 13 trillion rupees of loan went bad, and that is what brought the public sector banks and to a large extent some of the frontline private sector banks who would be corporate facing to their knees. That is now behind us. However, because of the fact that we had a kind of RBI and Supreme Court said you cannot mark loans as bad loans and so on. It is the mid-sized companies and the small-sized companies, I think, or even the SMEs, which are going to face the brunt of the problems. So as you go down the curve, whether it is the corporates or it is the individual loans, so for example, microfinance or small finance banks, those are the clients which will have serious stress because that is where job losses have been large, salary cuts have been large, losses of individual businesses have been large. People, who are either vendors or, for example, small businesses running, let's say, small restaurants, etc., which are basically which don't have huge amount of capital surplus, are the ones which are going to be under stress. And banks and any other institution lending to that, I believe that is still ahead of us. So if you are looking at corporate facing banks, I would argue that you are not likely to see a major problem unless what we are seeing now in terms of lockdowns were to perpetuate. My own thesis is that you will get another month of problems after which we should have hit the top and it will start to taper off. That may slow down the GDP growth a bit and so on because of the fact that you were expecting this year to be full 12 months of operations. Now it will be a little less. But it will not materially impact the larger companies because you are not really shutting down the business as such, unlike last year. And again, on a year-on-year basis, you still get growth. So I think the large companies are okay. So if you are looking at financial companies, I think those lending to large companies, I think they are over the hump. Those lending to unsecured lending, those lending to smaller companies, those lending to SMEs and doing cash flow financing for small companies, I think they will have some issues coming up.
Okay.
So coming back to what we were doing with in terms of money, what have people done with all the money besides keeping it in the banks? Now, this is a very startling data point that I found when I was working on this presentation. Just stop to think about this for a minute. The total amount of money that has gone into global equity funds, and we are talking about only funds, not private investments, in the last 5 months is close to $6 billion, $600 billion, 569, which is 25% more than the total amount that has gone into global equity funds in the last 12 years. Mm-hmm. So you just imagine the kind of impact that this largest of the central banks has done, that people are sitting at home, they have got suddenly checks coming into their accounts, they are unable to spend money. So what are they doing? They are putting money into investments. So a lot of what you are seeing in the markets today is because of this. Just think about it. Last 5 months flows are more than last 12 years flows by 25%. And that was funds. Now look at what is happening in brokerage accounts. So brokerage accounts, the red line is the margin accounts that happens. And as you can see, the margin accounts pretty much goes along with the market. Because obviously when you are feeling very bullish, you will buy more and more on margin. And that will push the market up till it stops going up. So right now we have had, as you can see on the graph on the right hand side, a percentage increase of margin, which is roughly 70% odd, over the last year before that. So huge amount of money has gone into equity funds and equity accounts of individuals. One other trend that is very important here, I think, in the US, is that with the entry of app-based brokers like Robinhood and so on, entry numbers have become very small. So earlier you would have had to put in a serious amount of money to buy a stock. Then it became one stock. Now it has become a fraction of a stock. So you can with the $10 you can start in trading, and you don't have, that is not an entry barrier anymore. I think this is a seminal change. I think it will affect the way market liquidity works for a long time to come going forward. But it will have its impact in terms of making the markets a lot more volatile. But remember, we are now sitting on a very highly leveraged market. One of the questions that I have seen people ask again and again is that, are we like in 2009 where there was a problem, the banks came in, put in a lot of money, the central bank supported the market, and the market went up and away after that, it has never looked back. So the difference is that in 2009, the ownership, if you see from the graph here, was roughly about 50 and 55% in that order of magnitude, somewhere during the time of the recovery. Today, it is the highest ever. So you are already at 75% asset allocation for the investment community as a whole in the US, which means that the scope for people to change their asset allocation and push more money into equity has now become somewhat limited. Please remember, whenever we are talking about fundamentals, there is no definite number. Can 70 go to 75? Of course it can. Will it necessarily mean that because we hit 70, it will turn around and start falling? Not at all. But all that it does is that as the numbers become higher and higher, and as it reaches numbers where it becomes difficult to move up from here, the probability of an adverse event happening starts to rise. And at some stage, it will turn around and become negative. And if you are at that time caught in a situation where because of illiquidity or because of your inability to move fast, you are left holding the baby at that time, then you will have a huge amount of volatility you will need to suffer.
But Anand, one more point I wanted to just ask you, related to the liquidity. India is a very, people talk about it's a very underpenetrated market, for equities. Investors don't typically invest in equities. I think last what I saw was about 7% of investors have invested in equities. That's what, typically is the investment allocation. Do you feel our investors, like what we call this time, it's different kind of a thing has happened that people are actually shifting from the traditional assets to equity and equity funds? And two, is it in line with the fundamentals? Where are we going from here, in fact?
Yeah, so let me first try and establish where are we on the fundamentals, and I'll come to that. But to answer your question about whether or not, we are only underpenetrated because we are 7%, and I assume you're talking about the Indian market.
Right.
We have to look at it from the point of view of how many people have ability and the surplus to be able to invest in the first place. So, you cannot at the same time say that, 40% of our population is below poverty line, and then say that, they are not investing in the equity market. Really?
Right.
So if you start looking at the number of families, so, if you have 130 crore people, then roughly that is 130 by 5, let's say, as number of families. So that's, whatever, 6.5 million that you will get to some number like that. 130 crores, 10% of that is
13 crores. Yeah, 6.5 crores. Yeah.
Yeah, 6.5 crores, right?
Right.
So 6.5 crore families. Out of that, you will say that we have 4 or 5, 6 crore accounts. That's 10% of the population in terms of families. Now, if you say that out of that 6.5 crore families, we have only half of them are, let's say, having any kind of investment surplus, or even less, then you are straight away talking about 2-3 crores. I mean, sorry, we're talking about 2-3 crores. So it's not like it's in the context of the country, as the wealth grows, certainly more and more people will invest. But at any point of time, to say that, we have overall out of the total population, we have only X number of people who have invested. Well, that's the universe that we have. So it's not as if. So the important thing is how much of their asset allocation has gone into equities. And if that is obviously more than what it should be, then you are setting yourself for a fall. Again, as I said, I would caution that none of these are hard numbers. It is not as if you hit some magic number and the market turns, or that it is independent of what is happening in the rest of the world. Tomorrow, if the market were to rally again in the US or in other parts of the world, more people will continue to make money here. If it were to turn around, irrespective of what we do here, it will also people will also run away from here. But I will come back to the valuation number in just a bit. Before I go to valuation, I wanted to quickly touch upon inflation. To my mind, this is a very important thing which is somewhat understood even today. Please understand that from 2008 or even earlier, we have had no inflation in the developed world. India has had a bout of inflation for a while, but we were an exception rather than the rule. Most of the developed world has not seen inflation. So most people who've entered the market in the last 10-15 years do not know what inflation is. And the large part of that is simply because of one factor, which is that in China was exporting deflation. Right? So whatever you want to make, you could buy cheaper from China, and therefore it didn't really matter what your money supply was and so on. So if you were to look at 2008, the initial stage of the QE, the fear was that inflation will come roaring back and therefore QE will be a problem. No inflation happened. And now it has become kind of passé to think that there is something called inflation, and therefore, the argument is that if it didn't happen then, what is different now? Well, something is dramatically different. Two things. First, every country today is putting barriers to entry for Chinese products. So therefore, your deflation exporter cannot export deflation anymore. A country like India has not only put entry barriers, they are also trying to prevent imports from China in various forms and shapes. We will not admit it, but it's very much true. So therefore, if you're going to put any kind of anti-dumping duty and so on, who bears the cost? Your domestic consumers. In other words, your prices go up. Now, as China becomes less and less welcome in most countries around the world, in the name of saying, efficiency is not the important thing, we need to make sure that we have sustainability, and therefore we have to diversify our supply chain. All of that in simple English means prices go up around the world. So that is the first trigger and the most important trigger for why inflation will come back. The second difference, and this is equally important, in 2008, the collapse of the market followed by a funding by the central banks was essentially not translated to inflation simply because the balance sheets of the banks were completely messed up. So the banks were using that opportunity of getting cheap money from central banks to repair their own balance sheet. If you see, there was no great credit growth at that time either.
Right.
In fact, almost none. This time around, the collapse has not happened because of anything wrong with the banks. The collapse has happened for an external factor. So the bank's balance sheets are exactly where they were before the collapse, and they are not the ones that have triggered the collapse. Importantly, all banks around the world, central banks around the world, have kind of almost guaranteed losses have kind of insulated the banks against losses due to COVID lending. So, for some time, the RBI also did that okay, if you loan something, if there is a loss on that, it will be taken care of by the central bank. And a lot more aggressive policy like that has been followed in the developed markets, which means that not only do the banks who are the commercial banks, not only do they not have a problem on the balance sheet, they have an active incentive to go out and lend. Because for them, it's free money. If there is a loss, it belongs to the central bank. If there is no loss, it belongs to them. So you've got the central bank put on commercial lending as well. So now when you have credit availability as well as a lack of supply from China, there is no way, to my mind, that inflation will not come back and come back roaring. We have seen the beginning of that already, right? The US yields are up, the tips, which indicates where we are in terms of market expectations, is already at 4%. So though you are still looking at about 2% or less in terms of actual inflation, the market expectation is higher. And despite this, central banks around the world, including our own, have been saying that, look, we will continue to remain neutral and we will continue to remain supportive and will continue to give you liquidity support, irrespective of, because we would rather push growth rather than worry about inflation. This is an ideal situation for a huge inflation overshoot. Now, is it going to happen tomorrow? Not likely. But is it going to happen? I think you have only to look at all the major commodities. Look at the last sharp movement in industrial commodity index, which is the one in blue, or the crude, or any other commodity that you want to think of. Every one of them have a graph which looks like it is going up to the sky. And this is not changing anytime soon. Therefore, you have to assume that inflation is here and here to stay, and it will overshoot all expectations, including of analysts. So my one caution for anyone listening to this is, do not underestimate the power of inflation in terms of screwing up your portfolio, whether it is debt or equity, because when at some stage the central banks will be willy-nilly forced by the market to react. And that is why we are already getting to a situation where people are talking about the central banks now fixing the yield curve. Can you imagine? We've got, what is free market in all of this? We are now not only saying that we will do, all those operation twist and things like that, but you're also saying I will fix the yield, because if you allow the yield to move, it will move up so much that you will have a problem in terms of the borrowing cost. Despite that, my argument is inflation is here and it will overshoot in the next 6 months. Look at the inflation trends here. In WPI, we are already above 6%. CPI, because we monitor it, will show the number that we want it to show, which will be below 6% because that's our upper bound. But despite that, in all of last year, it actually was consistently above 6%. Please understand, in India, we have actually a very strange thing. The MPC's mandate is very, very clear. It's a single line mandate to keep inflation between 4 plus and minus 2. They are not supposed to worry about growth. The previous MPC, if you look at the minutes of their meeting, never worried about the growth. They talked about it, but they actually reacted to inflation. The current MPC seems to have not read the act. At some stage, somebody will point poke a finger in their eye and tell them that the act does not mention growth. You have to worry about just the inflation. That's a single line target you have. So you have to take care of that. And at that time, you will have to see a raise in inflation. But for now, and this is why it is important from a portfolio construction perspective, you can assume that we have, a situation of RBI continuing to have an easy monetary policy and ample liquidity for near term, which means inflation continues to move up. Now, where are we on valuations? So the first one we look at is the one that is the least difficult, the one that moves the slowest, which is the book value. Now, you have something called Tobin's Q, which is some measure of that. Don't want to go into the technicalities of it, but you have to only look at the graph on the left-hand side and you can see that it is at the highest ever. And please note that this graph is all from 1950 onwards. So we have never had this kind of price to book, or price to Tobin's Q any time in the past. The last time that it was anywhere close was again in 2000, and then partially like that in just before the collapse right now. But it had been going up, but right now we are at a peak. The other one which moves slowly, you look at the one on the right hand side, that we have two of them, the price to sales and the price to earnings. The PE is something you are very familiar with, again an all-time high. Price to sales again is something that you could argue that many of the companies today, especially because they are in technology and they are trying to grow fast, are not reporting earnings, because the earnings are subdued because of the rapid growth they are undergoing, and therefore PE is not the right ratio to look at, in which case you should be looking at price to sales, because that is a lot less difficult to that can't be manipulated, or it is not affected because you are not making enough money. It is simply a question of how quickly you are growing. Despite that, it's at an all-time high, and it is not just an all-time high, it is 2.7, and I want you to keep that number in mind for a little while till I come to my next chart. The one after this, I'll come back to that right now. But the other thing that I want to talk about is the PE. Now, forward PE is something which you need to understand how it is calculated. So the analysts make estimates of what the companies will earn for the next 2 years, right, typically. And then we calculate a forward PE. So this graph that we saw a little while earlier, the one on the right, is on the forward PE. So it is assuming a certain growth in earnings, and then it is taking the forward PE on that. So after the growth in earnings, the forward PE is the highest it has ever been. Now let us see what this growth in earnings is all about. As you see over the last several years, This is not just limited to the US, it happens in India as well. So over the last decade, for example, we have just taken these squiggles. So what are these squiggles? These squiggles are that, you start, for example, today, we are sitting in 2021, we've been making estimates for 2022 and 2023. So you will be 24 or 25 months before the period, you will be making an estimate. And that the estimate of those earnings keep changing over time. So as they change, these squiggles appear, right? And as you can see, most of the squiggles head down. In other words, analysts are tuned to being very bullish about their forecasts. And if you look at the estimates on the right-hand side, from 1980 onwards, except for those 9 years of small green, which are the numbers where the analyst bullishness was actually realized and the market was and the earnings were a little better than that. The rest of the 21 years, it has been significantly worse. So you make an estimate and the actual number is well below that. And that happens 2 times out of every 3 times. And more importantly, the estimate is on an average down 33%. Now, when you keep that in mind and see the estimates for the next 2 years, you have to remember that the estimates for the next 2 years will probably suffer the same bias. Especially since the markets have gone up and therefore the mood is very bullish. So analysts will be forecasting a very bullish scenario. So in all probability, the PE that you are calculating today is actually going to be much lower than what it actually is, because the earnings will be lower than what you are forecasting. Now let's look at what is on price to sales. If you remember, I told you to keep in mind that we are at 2.7. This graph stops at 2. What it to measure is that the number of times that after you have had a price to sales, so let's focus on the graph at the point where it is 1. So when the price is 1, there have been only a few years where over the next 10 years, you've actually made a positive return. Most of the time at 1, your returns are close to 0. And a couple of years, your returns are positive over the next 10 years. So it's not like I'm trying to predict next year or year after. We're talking about the next decade. It stops at less than 2, because after that it is all negative. Currently at 2.7.
Right.
What does it tell you over the next 10 years? I leave you to make your own conclusions. Of course, you have with the caveat that history doesn't necessarily have to repeat itself, but it usually does. One last measure in terms of valuations. This is the other way of looking at it, market to GDP, market cap to GDP, right? So as you can see in absolute terms, if you look at the graph on the top, it is huge. It's already at a huge peak. But important is what happens when you detrend it. So this HP filter that you are seeing is a method of removing cyclicality from any data series. So that is why the graph on the lower side is actually a decycled graph, and that is why it's across a flat line and variations along the line. We are currently at 0.29 times in the mean. Now look at the note on the right hand side. Only in the last 70 years, there have been only 3 occasions where it has been greater than 0.2 times. Last was in January. So actually, if you ignore the current move, there has been only 2 times in the last 70 years where it has collapsed, where it has gone to this kind of valuation, which means that after this, the valuation becomes lower. So, either the GDP catches up or the market cap falls. So where are we in India? Similar story. We have a cyclically adjusted PE, which is way higher than it has ever been in the past, except for the peak before 2007. Right. Compared to emerging markets, we are at the highest premium that we have achieved in the last 15 years, probably longer. Our estimates also are booming. So we have a consensus earnings growth which varies depending on where you look, between 28 and 35% for the next year. For the current year now, and 16 to 18% for the year after that. And the argument is that the corporate profits to GDP has reached the bottom and it cannot fall from here. It can only go up, which is correct. But let's look at what the squiggles have been in terms of India. So the earnings upgrades have become to slow. So we had, starting from the middle of last year, we had a lot of upgrades. That has started to slow down. And in fact, in March, for the current year, there has been the first downgrade that we have seen. And importantly, and this is a figure that I want you to focus on, look at the EBITDA margins. We are now forecasting a margin which is the highest ever in the last 10 years. Now, keep in mind what I mentioned about inflation, right? So, if you see that where the numbers are coming from for the most of the corporate India, for the last quarter, we had a surprisingly good number, and I'm talking about December quarter, and March quarter is also following. Largely because we had many of the products being able to increase their prices while their raw material prices had not moved up because of the fact that, let's say you are a supplier of steel, you have a 6 monthly renewal of your contract, and therefore you change your prices only in the 6 months. So if you hadn't bought it up in October, you will now bring it up in March. In other words, the fellows who are using the steel would have shown you enormous margins in the quarters of ending December and March. But what will happen once you get into the June quarter? Once you have increased the price of, let's say you are an auto manufacturer and you've increased the price of the raw material, and now suddenly you find that we are in a quasi-lockdown situation, you're not going to be able to pass on price increases. So therefore, you will start to have a problem of margins. And typically, whenever the inflationary pressure starts, what happens is that the first flush, the end users always benefit because they are able to price their front end, their end prices much faster. The raw material prices catch up later. But if in about a year's time, the raw material begins to catch up and you begin to feel a pressure from the consumer in terms of taking constant price increases, and therefore your margins continue to fall. So at the least, this kind of peak margins, in my view, are unlikely to sustain beyond another couple of quarters at best. So you may have 1 or 2 more quarters of really solid margins, but I doubt very much that you will see it higher. Therefore, I wouldn't be surprised to see earnings again kind of being brought down a bit. Now, does it have to fall 33%? Not necessarily. But if you are pricing the market for a 35% growth, and then you end up with, let's say, a 20-25% growth, I don't think you are going to be very happy, especially when your valuations are already way beyond what they are in history. What has happened, therefore, in terms of the recovery? Because of the fact that we've begun to see some of these numbers, even before the COVID struck, if you see, most of the core sectors had begun to show weakness in February. And consumer index had fallen off even before that and remained low. Though so far, of course, India being a bullish country overall, very young, very bullish, the overall future expectation index continues to remain reasonably robust. This earnings yield versus bond yield is something which I'm sure you guys have been looking at and trying to figure out in your asset allocation thing. As you are aware, whenever that yield gap, the part in gray, is positive, it's a no-brainer for the market, right? Because that's the time when you are saying that a growth asset like equities is trading cheaper than a bond asset, which is giving you a fixed return. So that rarely happens. Right now, we are negative, but not largely so. And that's mostly because you've kind of maintained bond yields also in a way that it doesn't shoot. But net, we are still in the positive zone, so still there is an argument to be made for continuing to stick with equities. Where is the earnings going to come from? So I've taken up this from Kotak, Kotak Institutional Equities. As you can see, a large part of the earnings growth is coming from the cyclicals. So whether it is automobiles, the banking sector, the construction material, things like telecom. Of course, telecom is a special case, but transportation, diversified financials, these are all the large numbers where you are going to get, and of course metals and mining. These are the numbers which have done very well. Metals and mining, as you can see, has done very well even in the current year, in the year we just closed, and will continue to do well over the next 1 year. In fact, my argument is that if you follow my thesis that inflation will overshoot, I would argue that is one sector where analysts are still not factoring in how far the prices can rise, because they are still talking about linear growth, whereas you are likely to see non-linear kind of movements in those prices. So to my mind, metals perhaps have more earnings power than what the current numbers are likely to show. So it's the cyclicals that have been performing exceedingly well. And this graph captures it beautifully, because if you look at what this analyst in ISEC is calling cyclical earnings or volatile earnings, is actually all the cyclicals. They make up 61% of the market. So as you can see, the secular growth companies have been growing in a middling way between 8 and 12% kind of growth rates, and that has been pretty much consistent. And it is the problem has been with the cyclicals, which were not carrying their weight, and because they have a much larger weight, that's why the earnings growth for the index has been 5 or 6% year on year for the last several years. And it is because the cyclicals are now likely to shoot up and show you some stupendous growth that the overall growth for the market is likely to be fairly good this year. And that also gives you a clue as to why the money is going where it is in terms of asset allocation, that we are moving more towards cyclicals as opposed to secular growth companies. So, for example, here is the thing that is there in terms of the returns for the last year. And as you can see, the lowest returns are from on the right, things like staples, insurance, pharma, telecom, media, and so on, which are the secular growth sectors. And the rest of the sectors, which are the more cyclical ones where the earnings are more volatile, are the ones which have done exceedingly well, anticipating this kind of move that we are seeing.
This was actually completely the inverse of what it was before 2020.
Absolutely. So, but see, this is also why I'm arguing that inflation is here to stay, because it is that which will also push, the cyclicals to perform for a longer period of time, and where also the wider market participation will be higher, like we've seen in this, like we see in this graph. And I'm coming to the end of my presentation. If you see this, this is a little tricky graph, so I'll just walk you through it. The bottom graph is actually the top 500 put together, and then we have the top 50, the 50 to 100, 100 to 200, 200 to 500. Right. So as you can see, take any one. So if you see, for example, the month of February. In February, overall, the top 500 grew by 8%. The top 50 grew only by 5%, and all the others grew by 10%, 16%, 13%. So what it's telling you is that the market has become broad-based already, right? Because as I said, the frontline companies are more or less priced to perfection. So there is not that much that you can actually push in terms of performance there. However, as prices increase and import restrictions start to chop in, then a lot of the companies that are in the smaller, outside the index, main index, and or even in the index but who are smaller in size, are the ones that begin to perform better. And that is what we have seen now, and the whole thing is captured on the graph on the right hand side, where you've seen we've already made a move from the bottom. But if you see the previous peaks, we still have some way to go. I mean, they are nowhere close to where you could possibly go in terms of relative price movements. This next question is growth or value, right? And again, I take the cue from the US. For the last 20 years, if you see the graph, growth and value have had different periods of times. And not surprisingly, after 2008, where money became cheap and freely available, it has been growth that has performed consistently with no breaks, except for the last squiggle that you see in the last 12 odd months, where value has started to do well again and the growth has started to taper off. One simple way of looking at it is that, in the US especially, a lot of the growth companies are actually now companies without earnings. A lot of the IT companies which actually lead the rally are those which are supposed to have a global outlook, where they are saying that, oh, you have to grow so fast that you can't afford to show the profits. But if you think of it another way, they are going to behave like long bonds, long duration bonds, right? Where the earnings will come later, but you are paying the price today. So in other words, as interest rates go up, a bond with a long duration obviously suffers the biggest fall, right? So if you were to look at this and you keep in the context that actually interest rates are heading up, you can fully understand why growth companies which are very long dated in terms of their cash flows are likely to get severely impacted if interest rates were to move up, as opposed to those where cash flows are current and therefore it's a very short duration bond, it's going to do well. Same thing has happened in India. if you take from 2010 to March 2020, I've indexed it to 100. So we had growth going up from 100 to 146 and value staying from 100 to 97. So it did absolutely nothing for the last 10 years. But from 1st March 2020 till yesterday, 2 days back, growth has actually done only 9%, whereas value has done 40%. So all the heavy lifting that you've seen in the index has come because of the value stocks.
Right.
And that's a trend, like we pointed out, that it has not yet peaked. It's likely to continue. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Open for questions. But essentially, to summarize what I'm saying is, you're looking at a situation where inflation is going to come back. Interest rates will go up, even though the central banks will not let it go up immediately. Therefore, you have a small window of opportunity where you will continue to perhaps see markets move up. But markets don't have too much valuation gap right now, and earnings are probably already factoring in whatever maximum growth. Therefore, there can be a slowdown in earnings expectation, and which will mean the valuations are even more expensive. But till the turn doesn't happen, you are likely to see a broad market participation with value outstripping growth, at least for the near term. That, in a nutshell, is what I want to leave.
So Anand, it was very well summarized. All the questions which we had, you to ask. Most of them were very well summarized through, by putting in the numbers. There are some questions which are lingering. Is right. One is the behavioral part, which I think as advisors, or we cannot really do too much over there. But with interest rates down, which you have actually very aptly said, that the bond yield and the earnings yield, okay, the yield gap, there is opportunity for investing in equities even today based on the bond yield versus the earnings yield, in fact. But would it be a stock pickers market, or would it be sector specific? How does an investor approach going ahead from now?
Yeah, so if we go with the thesis that we are looking at a broader based market performance, clearly it is a stock pickers market, right?
Right.
But the problem is there are two things you have to worry about. One is that the large cap is the one that is the most liquid. Mid cap and small cap, actually performance depends on liquidity. So at this time we are in a very benign situation where liquidity is very easy, and because of the fact, as I said, earnings are going to be wider, the smaller companies will do much better. You have to keep an eye open all the time for when liquidity begins to shrink, because that is going to be a trigger where if liquidity were to come back, no matter what happens to the rest of the market, the mid cap and small cap will just collapse, because that is where the liquidity affects the movement the maximum. So, most of your investors will be very high net worth individuals, and I'm sure they are not trying to necessarily maximize the returns. They should be looking to get optimum returns, right? Or they should be looking to get returns where they have a steady portfolio which gives them less volatility. So my argument would be that this is not the time to increase asset allocation towards equity. Though it may appear that you are going to be missing out, I would imagine you have already got them into reasonable amount of equity exposure based on what you think is the risk appetite. This is not the time I think you should be looking to increase allocation to equities. If at all, you may want to ease off slowly. But that said, within equity allocation, you can certainly look to move towards a little more of the cyclicals. And some of it has already played out. In fact, probably half the move has played out, but there's still more to go, I think. So you could move towards more cyclical kind of plays, and you could move, of course, on the debt side, you continue to move into shorter duration or direct bonds where you can hold them to maturity so that you do not have an impact into them kind of thing. But it's not as if debt is any safer. If interest rates were to move up, as I claim they will, then you're going to lose money on that as well on the MTM. So you need the shortest duration that you can get, or you just hold it to maturity on a real bond and don't worry about the mark-to-market impact of it. But that's the best in terms of equity, that go with the cyclicals, go with the reasonably liquid names, add perhaps some small cap, mid cap, but with a clear understanding that you may have to exit to the door. Luckily, because all the central banks are committed to saying that we will offer, long-term kind of that they will keep it, neutral or liquid for longer than people think. You will probably get a signal when they want to change that. So you will have some time to, but you have to watch it very carefully.
No, but unfortunately, the bond market nowadays, the way they are behaving is more of the demand supply driven than what the RBI does. So even though RBI is not, going to increase the rates and they're trying to keep a status quo, the effect is already seen in the bond market in the last 3-4 months, where actually, there have been near zero to negative returns in the bond markets. In the yields actually have actually shot up over there. Uh, in fact, Harmeet, do you have any questions? Harmeet has summarized a few questions which the audience has asked. Harmeet, I would request you to keep it restricted to three. Keeping in time. Basically we should not overshoot on time. So, Harmeet, you just ask the questions quickly. Hmm?
Yes, sir. So, we do have a few questions for you. One of them being, what will happen when the effect of the infusion support by the central bankers wears off? How would it impact the markets?
Well, if they don't continue to support the market, there is no market. I mean, this is a market where we are basically, it is simply a tsunami of money. All boats have risen. The tsunami moves out, then, no matter what. I mean, think of a tide on top of a tsunami. The tide is 5 feet, the tsunami is 50 meters. No matter what happens to the earnings, if the tsunami moves out, that 5 feet is irrelevant in the 50 meters.
But Anand, that's
Absolutely.
a dangerous situation, na?
Oh, of
You know,
course it is dangerous, but
the
then,
market is
dangerous for
moving
what?
only because of liquidity, in fact.
No,
Not
absolutely. Like I showed you, the kind of money that has been so. If you put in money, like 70% of your total cash, of your total money supply comes in the last 12 months. I
right.
mean, what else do you expect?
Absolutely.
Sir, and the next question for you is, what would the impact of tightening restrictions amid the second wave of the COVID-19 have on the companies, earnings of various companies?
So there is no specific way to look at this except for how much is the on a kind of somewhat on a sector specific way. So first of all, the difference between last year and this year is we have not had a full shutdown. So it's not as if businesses can't work. But businesses are going to be impacted, no doubt. I mean, take a simple case like oxygen, right? Today we are saying that all steel companies cannot produce steel because they are producing oxygen and giving it for medical reasons. Now, which will mean that for the period, even if it is 2 weeks, what it will mean is that your steel supply, etc., will be impacted for a period of 2 weeks, which is a 4% impact on the overall scheme of things. Now, to the extent that it is only 4% as opposed to what we had last year, the numbers will be small. And luckily, like I said, because steel is in short, is one of those sectors which has done exceedingly well. It will be absorbed in the pricing overall because they will raise the prices a little bit more, and it will go away. So overall, your earnings will continue to be fairly robust. You may not see it. But for smaller businesses, especially the mid cap, not the listed ones, but the actual SME business, it has a serious impact. It's not so easy for people to actually work from home for many of the businesses. Many of the so-called plays that we had for opening up will suffer. The difference between last year and this year is finally the vaccine, right? Last year you had no option. You had to just stay at home. Today we are at a situation where we have roughly 25% of the senior, 45 plus kind of population, which has been already vaccinated. And I'm hoping that now with the private sector being allowed to come in and pricing restrictions being removed, give it a couple of months, you will have enough supply coming through and you should be able to accelerate your vaccination very quickly. So I think over the next two or 3 weeks, as we peak out in terms of this whole wave of COVID, you will get better numbers coming through both in terms of infections and with vaccinations catching up in another couple of weeks as well. The immunity levels, I mean, the number of people who are immune or protected against the virus will also go up. So I don't think that it's going to be something which will impact us like we did last year. But that said, against, let's say, a 35% expectation of earnings growth, take your pick. Maybe 20%, 25%, maybe 20%. If against your 12.5% GDP expectation, maybe 10%.
Or
Anand, one question which your dear friend has asked is what is the MI equivalent in India? M1 equivalent in India.
Yeah, there is an M1 here as well. There is an M1, M2, M3. Earlier we used to track M3. Then the US fellows stopped giving some of those numbers. I have
Right.
taken it's the most dramatic. It's not the best way of looking at money supply. It's just that it has the highest growth that you can see. So I decided that the impact of that in terms of showing it on the graph would be the highest now. But
Right.
actually, the US really tracks M2 more than M1, and we track M3 most.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
These are all measures of money supply. They are, you can just Google them.
Okay.
So we have one more question from the audience. So how well would India's self-sufficiency bid work in the next short to medium term? And are we poised enough to meet the demand for essential capital goods such as steel and other important equipment?
That's a very big question. See, we are self-sufficient and we are not. So, for example, as you are aware, take pharma, right, where we say, oh, we are the pharmacy of the world. And yet, 70% of what is called KSM, that is a key starting material, which is a material which you use, which is essentially bulk chemicals, which then goes into making the API, which then goes into making the formulation. 70% of it was being imported from China. So even something like a simple penicillin we could not make in India without having to get it from China. So, that self-sufficiency is actually not the target that we should be hoping to achieve. I mean, there is, after all, a reason why countries specialize in activities, and we cannot. So, for example, take semiconductors, right? Nobody in the world makes semiconductors except for Taiwan and to some extent US, etc. India has two small foundries, both of which are useless. So for all practical purposes, we will continue to remain. Now, can we say that yes, we can make mobile phones without making semiconductors? But we are supposedly now exporting mobile phones. So it depends on what you mean by self-sufficiency. Can we make clothes? Possibly yes, because we grow cotton, we make yarn, and we make clothes. So cotton clothes we can make, and yet Bangladesh is bigger than us by far. So I don't think self-sufficiency is enough. What people are now talking about is to say that, look, we need to have multiple sources of supply. So it cannot be simply that we buy everything from China. If something happens which prevents that supply chain from working, we need to have alternate source of supply. And consequently, as a country, we are hoping to plug into that. If it becomes protectionist and we go back to the stage where you have the Bombay Club and the pre-1991 situation, then we are in deep trouble. They pack your bags and go to Portugal.
So I think it's typically you can have India as an alternative to China. It can't be a replacement to China. In fact,
well, not by a far shot even now. I mean, China is not. It's a huge machine producing feeding the world. It cannot be taken out of the equation anytime soon. No other country has that kind of size or the capacity. Even if you have to replicate it, it will take years before you can do it, and in many cases, it will not be viable. So even technology. I mean, think about it. I'll give you one specific example, right? CGR. I mean, there is a special grade of steel that is used in making transformers. The Tata Steel has taken over the Chorus, which can make it, but Tata Steel cannot make it in India. Only now we are talking about trying to make it in India. After so many years and millions of tons of steel capacity, don't have a company which can make specialized steel. Why do we still continue to import automobile steel from the rest of the world?
true. Yes, Amit.
So that's it from the audience.
It was Anand wonderful actually. We got a lot of insights. I'm sure our audience will take away a lot of learnings from this series. In fact, Harmeet, could you give in the opening closing remarks, please?
Certainly, sir. So, as sir already mentioned, this was quite an insightful presentation. It puts a lot of things into perspective for both seasoned investors, especially people who are looking to enter the markets for the first time. So, on behalf of Cedrus Wealth Partners, I would like to thank you for making time to grace this event, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in large numbers and making this event a success. We will be back next month with a new topic and a new speaker. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, and happy investing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nilesh. Thank you, Harmeet.
Thank you.